Hello, my friends. I'm going to tell you the story of Ukraine's incredible attack on Russia. In the very heart of Russia, planes were hit by drones all the way to Vladivostok on the Sea of Japan. I am going to tell you the technical details, what we know today about this attack, but also how it brings us closer to a potentially nuclear conflict. There are red lines that have been crossed. I'll explain it to you. Today is June 1st. Russia suddenly wakes up to 4 airports across the country being hit by swarms of drones. We're talking about dozens, between 30 and 50 drones each, armed with 2 explosive devices that drop and target what? Aircraft tied to the nuclear deterrent strategic bombers. The oldest ones that were hit are the Tupolev 95 bombers. You can recognize them in old Cold War movies. They're relics from the 1950s, but don't let that fool you. These aircraft have 4 engines, driving 8 propellers with 15,000 horsepower per engine. They are capable of climbing to flight level 450 and have the same range as an Airbus A350. So these are aircraft that, even though they are extremely old, are still formidable. They are capable of carrying nuclear weapons or conventional missiles and then rain them down indiscriminately. They were hit in broad daylight and a number of them were destroyed. We're talking about costs, according to sources, of $2 to $7 billion. But the reality is that it's priceless because you can't really put a dollar value on the damage, since these aren't planes that are for sale. You know, these aren't planes that can be easily replaced. So some of them don't exist anymore, they're simply no longer being made. And others are more modern. The most modern plane that was hit dates from 2022. These are extremely modern aircraft as well, and they were all hit while on the ground. So, I'm going to answer a number of questions and give you the scenario as it stands today. What happened? Well, here's how it works. In the days leading up to June 1st, attacks were carried out against airports that are not very far from the Ukrainian border. This was a psychological operation that forced Russia to move its planes there. They ordered their pilots to take those planes further inside the country. So they took them, as I said, all the way to Vladivostok, up to 7,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. So at that point they're safe. There's no drone that can come bother them. The drones don't have that kind of range. Another thing, maybe another detail that will stand out. It's that these planes, which are priceless, important, strategic, all that, they're parked outside. They parked them in parking lots right there in plain sight of everyone. Why aren't they protected? Why aren't they covered with camouflage nets? Why aren't they stored in hangars? The reason is that Russia is forced to keep them outside. That is, there is an agreement called START 3 or New START, which dates back to 2010. But in reality, the history of these agreements doesn't date back to 2010, but rather to the Cold War, when things started to ease up a bit. These are non-proliferation agreements. These agreements require the United States and Russia to keep their strategic bombers out. That way, spy satellites can fly over, count them, know how many there are, because their number is limited, it's a non-proliferation treaty, and find out whether they're armed or not. So, there's an obligation to leave them outside. So, we took advantage of that framework to strike them. That's the first point. Now, the other point is, how were we able to find them so far away? How were we able to strike with drones deep inside Russia? Well, here's what was done. According to what is known today, it's that a warehouse was rented. So, Ukrainian operatives rented a warehouse for about 4,000 euros per month in a city that is not very far from the border with Kazakhstan. So, probably Kazakhstan served as a rear base for that operation. So, they rented this warehouse and they claimed it was a business selling portable cabins. You know, those cabins that can be made of metal or wood, which are set up as temporary offices at construction sites and other events. So, it's a company. They claim to sell that kind of items. That's it. What they did was transfer them inside Russia, so by crossing the borders, probably, well, we'll see, right? Those borders are probably like sieves. It's probably possible to pay to get anything across. They brought in a lot of drones. These are 4-propeller drones, quadcopters. They brought in drones. So they brought these drones and they put them in the hangar. After that, here's what they did. In these drones, they installed software. It's Mission Planner software, which is open source. You can download it without any problem. And then they also used an altitude plugin with it. It was a plugin that allows the drones to stabilize at a certain altitude. And actually, the software plus the plugin or plugins that were deployed had one main purpose, which was to create a drone flight that is stable and predictable while avoiding the use of GPS positioning. Because in fact, GPS in certain regions, and especially near sensitive military airports, is extremely disrupted these days. That means there are signal jamming and all that. And so the drones couldn't rely on it. That's what they did as well. And that's where the situation is really on top of the impact, on top of the material impact, we're talking about 34%. That's the Ukrainian side saying that 34% of Russian strategic equipment, strategic aircraft have been destroyed. The Russians will probably say it's less. It doesn't matter who's wrong or who's right. But in any case, the psychological impact is very strong. Why? Because these drones were apparently equipped with GSM chips with Russian SIM cards so they could transfer data and stay in contact with their operator to send images, because these are drones that are piloted remotely using real-time images. And that allows a pilot who could potentially be in another country to control them all the way to their target. So the thing is, the hangar I'm talking about, I'll explain that a bit later, but the hangar I'm talking about was located 4 kilometers from the FSB offices. You see, that might give you an idea of the psychological blow as well, because all military operations throughout history have always had a strategic side. It's the direct impact, the damage, the noise, the flames, and so on. But they also have a psychological side. And here the psychological aspect is really strong. Because we have this impression, as outside observers, that for the FSB, as long as we don't park an Airbus A380 on Red Square, and as long as there aren't people tweeting about it, they won't know anything at all, because we have Ukrainian operatives coming in. They rent a warehouse 2 streets away. They bring in trucks, they bring in containers, drones, and they're going to take 150 bags of cement and so on. And the FSB didn't see a thing. We realized that maybe we have this situation like in the USSR. You know, it's the legacy, it's the dark legacy of the USSR. An administration that is very cumbersome, very inefficient, plagued by their bureaucracy, all that. So it's true that they are impressive at first glance, but in terms of efficiency, well, there you go, you see the result. Donc, so what happened is that from this warehouse, we brought in 5 trucks and we brought in drivers. So the drivers aren't involved, right? They're just looking for work. We told them they deliver for us. So what we did for them was we took semi-trailers, we put these wooden portable cabins on top, and we gave each of them an address. We told them, here you go. Go to the location, park, and wait for the client. The client may arrive with an IVA, and you'll follow him to the construction site. So they probably, actually, it's not even probably, it's definitely, they must have staggered or scheduled the departures of the trucks so that they all arrived in their area, right, to start at the same time. So they all have to arrive at the same time because the goal was to launch the attack all at once to avoid precisely, because if one airport is hit, then the Russians can realize there's an attack going on and so on and scramble the bombers. So for the Ukrainian side, they had to strike all at once. That's what they did. So they had to stagger the departures of the trucks because some probably left 2 or 3 days before the others. You know, because when you look at the distances they had to cover by truck, it was probably several days. They probably left around the end of May. So in the roofs of the porta cabins, there was a kind of false bottom that was set up. So inside this false bottom, the drones were placed. So the drones were loaded, programmed, all that, placed in the false bottom, and then the truck drivers left. They were told, what you do is park, each at your destination, you wait, we'll call you, we'll tell you what to do next. The parking spots were always roads or stations, gas stations or others extremely close to the targeted airports. So the targeted airports, well, exactly, they looked and chose places that were extremely close, just a few hundred meters away. That means the drone now only has to fly, well, it's transported by truck, and then it only has to fly a few hundred meters to hit its target. So the trucks arrived, the drivers parked, and suddenly they heard a massive explosion. What happens is that the roof of the portable cabin itself is blown off by a pyrotechnic device. And that's where they lost a truck, because in reality there were 5. That means the attack could have literally destroyed half of Russia's strategic arsenal. So here's what happened. There were 5 trucks and one of them caught fire when the pyrotechnic device was triggered. So it caught fire and the drones were destroyed. However, the other 4 worked. What does that mean? It means that the drivers watched helplessly as swarms of drones, 30 to 50 drones per truck, took off and then went directly toward the airports. They hit the planes that were on the ground, so it was the same, they couldn't even move. They hit them one after another. And then they caught fire and were destroyed. The images are quite impressive. These roads are used by trucks. Sometimes there are chains of trucks literally for miles, one after another. That means they chose routes where there won't be a police checkpoint, where someone says, hey, what's this truck with an out-of-area license plate doing here? No, they deliberately chose routes with a lot of heavy truck traffic. So they knew that the chances of getting stopped were really, extremely low. The risk of getting arrested was reduced. Also, the paperwork was likely in order for everything else. So there's a scene near an airport. And this scene, practically, it has an almost biblical quality, to be honest. Because what we see is that the residents are throwing stones, big rocks at the drones. They're trying to bring down the drones, but I'm not sure if they've succeeded. Maybe they got 1 or 2 with this rather outdated method. That means we find ourselves in a situation where we have a deterrent arsenal, which is covered by international treaties. START, spy satellites that pass by every few hours to photograph it, to catalog it. Analysts at Langley or elsewhere who are there cataloging every plane and everything in their Excel spreadsheets. And then suddenly, by rather rudimentary means, they are destroyed. And the population is forced to protect them like 1,000,000 years ago by throwing stones. That's the equation. So afterwards, there are Telegram channels and Ukrainian media that have broadcast images of it, even if they were partly blurred images of the hangar. And well, what happened is that the Russians managed to identify the hangar and they went into it. It wasn't the FSB, since even after the attack, they didn't know the attacker's origin. It's because, due to a slip or carelessness by the Ukrainian media, the hangar was able to be located. So they located the hangar, they found out who was behind it. The problem is the guy or the guys who actually started the whole thing, they were already gone. They had left 2 or 3 days earlier. Since the 28th, they weren't there anymore. Nobody had seen them again. So, of course, now the police, to take out their frustration, are going to arrest who? They're going to arrest the owner of the hangar. They're going to arrest 2 or 3 guys, the guard, the drivers, people who have nothing to do with it, who are just as much victims as everyone else. They're going to arrest them because they need to have someone on hand. But the real masterminds, they've disappeared. Now, it's also possible that this whole thing was organized by Ukraine, but probably also with some Western help. American help, potentially, maybe, but I doubt that the Americans today really want to get their hands dirty in this matter. Maybe they don't want to leave any traces. Except for those 3-letter agencies, which can sometimes get involved and be hard to control. The British, I would say, are maybe more credible because they're pushing for escalation. In 2022, remember when they were about to sign in Turkey, there was going to be an agreement between the Russians and the Ukrainians which would have saved lives and all that. Well, what they did was send Boris Johnson, who rushed over to say, don't sign, don't sign. He went to Zelensky and said, above all, don't sign because we want more war. Remember, you probably don't remember anymore, huh? Most people have forgotten this story. There was a war recently between India and Pakistan. Do you remember that? That war is over now. Why? Because work was done. There was de-escalation efforts, diplomatic efforts, calls for disarmament, calls for mediation, calm, all of that. The usual methods to calm a war and save lives. Whereas in this situation, everything seems to be done to make things worse. Now let's talk about deterioration. Here's the problem. The thing is, this system, these planes, are part of a larger setup that involves planes, missiles in silos, and so on, and also involves submarines. The problem is that today the Russian nuclear system is less operational because the air component has been destroyed or rendered unusable, at least for the most part. And so this will create more tensions within Russia and within the establishment about using nuclear weapons. Because in their doctrine, specifically of nuclear deterrence, it's that if their nuclear capability decreases, it means that their ability to strike or retaliate to an attack decreases. Well, this increases the likelihood that they will use nuclear weapons first. Let me tell you a little story, quickly. Nuclear deterrence is not based on who has a weapon and who is able to strike. That's not it. That was the first 3 days of nuclear deterrence. Yes, it started like that. I have an atomic weapon, I can hit you. The other guy replies, yes, I have an atomic weapon too and can do the same. That's the beginning. That's the Middle Ages of nuclear deterrence. Today, nuclear deterrence is based on what we call second strike capability. What does that mean? It means that at first, as Bruce Lee used to say, it's the one who strikes first who wins. Isn't that right? Because if two opponents are both armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, well, the one who strikes first wins because the other one is already wiped off the map. So we realized that in terms of deterrence, it wasn't real deterrence, it was more of an incentive to strike first, okay? So what happened is that the two main countries in this story, we're mainly talking about the United States and Russia, developed second strike capabilities. That means that even if a country is wiped off the map, technically speaking, it is still able to retaliate and destroy its adversary. And that's where it gets interesting. That's where we're really talking about deterrence. Because if one of the countries strikes the other can still use, for example, planes that take off, submarines or other tools to strike back, take revenge, and also destroy the other country. The problem is that if Russia feels that its second strike capability or its nuclear capability in general is decreasing, let's say, for example, they have missile launching submarines that are not operational, we don't know. What do we know about that? We don't know. Not at all. That's the part of the story we don't know. It could be that some of their nuclear missile submarines are not operational. Maybe they're bluffing. Maybe they don't have them anymore. Maybe they're somewhere rusting or they have problems with parts or repairs. We don't know any of that. So there's also the side that we don't know about. And now that their air force is in danger, has been partly destroyed, and the rest will be destroyed tomorrow, maybe by next Friday, they won't have any planes left. All right. In that case, the temptation to strike first will inevitably increase. That means, in that case, they will program their missiles that are in silos and so on to target capitals like Washington, Paris, London, and so on. And that's what they did, apparently. That's what the rumors say. I'm not sure if the sources are valid. I'm putting that in very heavy quotes. But these are the messages we see going around saying that Russia has programmed its missiles to target European capitals, etc. Those messages, we don't know their source, we don't know if they're true or not, but there's one thing, they make sense. You see what I mean? Yes, it fits into a rational framework. If the Air Force is destroyed, the missiles have to be even more operationally ready because now they're much more critical. There you go, my friends. That was just to talk to you a little bit about what we call the Russian Pearl Harbor. And let's keep our fingers crossed that this doesn't turn into an irreversible escalation. See you very soon.